you have that ambition, there are going to be compromises. And I'm sure that the proposals today are going to be really, really closely scrutinised by the local councils, particularly by residents if it comes under areas that are near them, and also by the builders.
With one of the big things expected to be announced in the King's Speech being planning reform, do you think the government is right to take the fight to the NIMBYs, the Not In My Backyard Brigade? Clearly, we have a housing crisis in this country, but is just overhauling the planning system the right response, in your view? What do you reckon? Maybe we do need to build on the green belt, or maybe you think we need to be a bit careful. 87222 to text. Start your message with the word Times. You can tweet at Times Radio or WhatsApp 0333 003 2353 is the number. 6 minutes past 5. And less than 2 weeks after taking office, the government will set out its legislative priorities in the King's Speech later. Keir Starmer is expected to put economic growth at the centre of his plans. It's understood new rules will come in, meaning people won't be able to object to house building on land identified by their local council. The Times' policy editor, Oliver Wright, says it could prove controversial.
I think the problem comes not today, not tomorrow, but in a year or two's time, when you get these things go up before the planning committees and local residents really see how this affects them. One of the interesting things is obviously Labour have all these new MPs. Some of those are in areas that are going to be affected by this. So you could see, not immediately, but over a sort of longer period of time, a building up, as it were, of opposition to some of this.
Well, let's find out more now with our correspondent, Jessica King. Good morning, Jessica.
Good morning, James.
What exactly is the government proposing when it comes to the planning system then?
Well, the housing providers have said that projects over the years have been delayed or cancelled because of what they call significant financial pressures, but also the uncertainty. So firstly, the government are going to have to spend a huge amount of money to bolster housing associations and local councils' housing budgets. But also, have you been talking about, they're going to have to give them more power just to go ahead and build. And that is what they say is going to stimulate the growth. Now, they've already talked about greenbelt land, brown belt land, but they also want to release grey belt areas. Now, grey belt is land that's not particularly attractive, not particularly pretty, but it's protected. So they want to get rid of that and use those areas for development. They also want to introduce planning laws, as you mentioned, to force local councils to identify areas in their locality that could meet future potential housing needs. And we've also heard of towns bills. So they want to build completely new towns and urban extensions on existing towns. So pretty forceful plans, pretty ambitious. Labour say they want the biggest boost to affordable housing for a generation. And in their manifesto, they committed to building 1.5 million homes over the next 5 years. So I imagine those targets will be echoed in the King's Speech today. But as you say, when you have that ambition, there are going to be compromises. And I'm sure that the proposals today are going to be really, really closely scrutinised by the local councils, particularly by residents if it comes under areas that are near them, and also by the builders.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you mentioned, Jessica, this is all part of the government's wider push to try and boost economic growth. I mean, yesterday they had some good news. The IMF upgraded its growth forecast for the UK, but it's still not going to be enough by the looks of things to fill the gap in the public finances. I mean, does that mean, bigger picture, zooming out here, at some point Labour are going to have to choose between raising taxes and spending cuts?
I think, to be honest, it's inevitable. I think the government is likely to face some of the most difficult economic choices the UK has faced outside of the pandemic, outside of major crises like the war in Ukraine. The situation isn't good. And as the IMF have said previously, everything is harder when the economy is growing slowly and public finances are more constrained. So as Labour and before them, the Conservatives have really stressed it's all about stimulating growth. That is what is going to give people more money in their pockets. That is going to get these big building projects on the go. And that is also why the King's Speech today is really important, as the government is going to set out 35 bills with economic growth at the heart. And as Keir Starmer has said many, many times, it's his mission to rebuild Britain. But really, I was thinking about this and, Labour, they have a huge seat majority in government. They're in this honeymoon period with the public. Keir Starmer's approval ratings are up since the election, according to a YouGov poll. So perhaps this is really as good as it's going to get for Keir Starmer and the Labour Party in terms of pushing forward these really bold plans, these bold ideas, and in terms of the public being engaged and supportive with what he's trying to do. I mean, if he's not going to be bold now, when can he be? But on the flip side of that, Labour have got to think about, they've always talking about their fiscal responsibility. They've got to keep that in mind, and they've got to prove to the public that they can focus on all these, missions and crucially deliver them on time and on budget.
Yeah, so what are some of the other bills that we're expecting in the King's speech today, Jessica? I mean, obviously planning reform is dominating, it's on the front of the Times this morning, but lots more besides.
Yep, some of the other big ticket items on the agenda today are going to be legislation to nationalise the railways. So that will allow the government to take on responsibility for running pretty much most passenger services when the existing contracts expire. They're also talking about the establishment of Great British Energy. So that will be a new state-owned company that will be based in Scotland, and that will invest in renewable energy projects, including emerging tech like offshore floating wind farms and clean hydrogen. So lots of green projects there. There's also an employment rights bill we're expecting to hear more about. So banning the use of zero-hour contracts and this sort of fire and rehire practice. And on the NHS, we have heard a lot about that already, but more detail on that and essentially an increase in NHS appointments. We're also expecting more detail on Labour's plan to tackle the gangs that smuggle migrants across the Channel in small boats. We know about the Miranda plan, but there'll be more detail on how they plan to give police more power on that. And they also want to resurrect some of the policies that were promised by the Tories, but which they never delivered on, such as a ban on no-fault evictions and also a ban on young people ever being able to smoke.
And of course, we'll have coverage of the King's speech throughout the day here on Times Radio. Jessica, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much. Correspondent Jessica King there with a look at the day's politics.